Welcome to the SWIKE podcast, the only podcast that shares the stuff you didn't know you needed to know about jobs, careers, and life. The SWIKE podcast, the stuff I wish I knew earlier.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the SWIKE Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier, the podcast. We're here with Ellie again, and she wanted to share some of her insights, or I wanted her to share some of her insights on what can someone do with a biology degree. Because the natural course is to become a doctor or nurse or somewhere in that kind of healthcare field, and then to become a researcher or a professor and on that, down that path. But you took a slightly different path and kind of got open to like industry and things like that. So can you kind of recap us on your journey into that and then your, I'll call it awakening, for lack of a better word, that there's actually more out there than just kind of the traditional. And this is probably true with other degrees as well, but we'll start with biology and what else could folks look out to looking at?
Great, thanks, Luki. So when I was in undergrad, I definitely had a mindset that was similar to a lot of other folks in that I understood the top two options were or the top one option was to go to medical school, and the top number two option was to continue in academia and to become a professor. And so I definitely had a little bit of a rude awakening when I realized that medical school wasn't for me and neither was academia. This was around the end of my second year of undergrad, and I had to start thinking about what my career options were otherwise. And so this word industry was something that I had heard of, but I didn't really understand what it was until I was able to gain some more understanding, mostly by talking to folks and by networking, to understand that the industry refers to everything related to different companies who are producing things like medicines and medical devices. And so that was really interesting to me to work for a company as opposed to working for as a doctor in a hospital or as a researcher for a university. And so the main thing that Luki and I will be chatting about today is how I was able to learn a little bit more about the industry that I work in, which is pharmaceuticals, but also about how I gained a little bit of insight into other industries like medical devices, for example, or also environmental biology, which is another option for folks to go into. And I also was able to learn a little bit about fields like consulting, which is a kind of a scary word for some. Um, and I was able to do that all through networking. So, Luki, I'll be happy for you to ask me more questions about that. Let's go
Sure.
from there.
If we can step back and maybe go to that rude awakening, if you're okay to relive that side. And so you were on the path to either going into med school or research and things like that. Then how did you kind of knock either one of those off your list? So for the folks that have their biology degrees and they're kind of considering the same path, how do you make the decision, I guess, not to choose them, or to say, you know what, actually, this is probably the right path for you to follow?
Great question. So, around the end of my second year and the beginning of my third year of undergrad, I had amassed some research experience working in a biology lab at UTSC. And I realized that I really enjoyed working with my team and being in a collaborative environment, but I didn't necessarily feel energized by working by myself on my experiments. I thought it was cool conceptually, but it just wasn't something that I was really jumping out of bed to do in the morning. And so around that time, I learned that you could enter the industry, which meant, again, working for a company. And I knew from speaking to other students in co op programs that there's this big company named Sanofi Pasteur that makes vaccines and that they hire co op students every year. And so I thought that that was a great way for me to be able to get my foot in the door and to learn what it's like working for a company that makes medicines as opposed to being a researcher who might work on more of a development point of view, or as opposed to being a doctor who works directly with patients. So I was thinking, what's it like working at a company? I don't know anything about this. And so I would definitely say that part of this rude awakening was realizing that working solo in a lab might not have been the thing that was energizing me. And so the interesting thing is when I applied as a co-op student to work at Sanofi Pasteur, I had lab experience. So the job that I was qualified to do at Sanofi was also to work in a laboratory. And so I worked in analytical research and development at Sanofi Pasteur, and I did that for a year and a half.
Mm.
Again, working in R&D for a company was an amazing learning opportunity. I loved working with my team. I loved presenting my results to my teammates. I loved to brainstorm with my manager and my other colleagues to come up with new ways to do things. I loved being part of this collaborative learning environment. But what I didn't love was, again, to sit by myself at the bench and to actually be doing my experiments.
Right.
And so again, this is part of my rude awakening that I realized, oh, I really like the collaborative, the people aspect, but maybe not so much the actual bench science part of it.
Right.
So
And I
that was
wanted
part of
to,
my journey.
yeah, so I want to dig a little bit about like the folks that again are considering their options. So we didn't really talk about how I guess med school got taken off the table. Was there a kind of a decision point there to say like, nope, definitely not doctor nurse, that path was out? Or is it really more that, hey, I ended up finding this industry path, and you know what, let me continue on that, and that's good enough.
I think very early on, I realized that it takes a certain type of person
Hmm.
to be able to succeed in medical school. You need a really, really, really strong internal drive to be able to do that.
Hmm.
And it was just never fully aligned with me.
Okay.
So I was definitely more of the route of becoming a professor.
Okay. So
Yeah.
you
But
went up.
again, I thought it was binary and it wasn't.
Cool. Yeah. So you went down the research path, and then you find because what came to mind is it really the type of work, or is it more the fact that maybe it was just the lab and the colleagues that were there? Like, no offense to the people that you work with or something, but it could have been that the ones in the second lab were just more kind of more fun. You were more aligned with whatever. And had you worked in like in a really fun professor's lab, I don't know if that's such a thing, but then maybe you could have done it, because you mentioned that it was really the bench science that wasn't what you're into. Or the other part I was extrapolating was maybe it's kind of that incremental to say, oh, actually, it's the bench science, and then hey, there's this other part of bench science that's even further beyond it that I could pursue, right? So, do you think there was an aspect of like that bench science that would have been appealing to you, or is it just that work is totally off?
Okay, good question. And I'll answer your question by talking about something uh, new, which is that throughout undergrad, I was doing a lot of extracurriculars.
Okay.
I would join student clubs like the Biology of Student Association. And I realized that, again, the things that I was drawn towards was not necessarily doing projects by myself.
Hmm.
My passion projects were all aligned with helping other people and working directly with other folks,
Right.
especially like newer students in a mentoring capacity or working with the team to host an event. So definitely to answer your question about, what I thought I was being drawn towards, I was realizing both through my work and through my extracurriculars that I was being drawn towards a really like collaborative team environment, and that's where I was getting my energy from. And then I realized that in both the research that I was doing at UTSC and the research that I was doing at Sanofi Pasteur, what was draining me a little bit was the hardcore, like the bench science part of it.
Right.
So this is also to say that doing extracurriculars and getting involved in clubs is a really, really amazing way to learn more about your strengths and what brings you energy. And I was really using that idea about what energizes me to drive me further um, towards the career that I'm doing now.
I think that's a great point. So one of the tools and techniques that I recommend folks to do is what I call the 5-2-2-1 journaling, which is basically 5 minutes a day and 2 minutes on what drained you, right? As specific as you can, what you were doing, the people you were with, the environment and everything. And then 2 minutes on what energized you, right? Again, as specific as you can, what you were doing. And then 1 minute on how do you minimize the first, the stuff that drains you, and how do you maximize the second. And then after weeks, after months, after years, then you start noticing patterns. So I think that would have been a good technique or tool for you to have used during that. And I think you already did that kind of inherently,
Yeah.
where you didn't formally do it on that. But for those who are trying to figure out what are these things that energize me and light me up, often that's a good technique.
Yeah.
And I would also echo to do the student club stuff, right? Because if you're stuck in kind of the four walls of the classroom, yeah, there's stuff there, but there's so much more in the outside world. So, were there any kind of hints during any of those kind of sessions? And like, did they present industry, or did they bring it forth, or would you have that exposure without a co-op? Because I'm thinking of those where you got it by necessity of being in a job there and you got exposed to an industry. But are there other ways to explore or
Yeah,
um,
absolutely.
opportunities?
Yeah, that's a great point that you bring up. I realize I have the privilege of, being exposed to the industry even before I was able to graduate. So I definitely recognize that not everybody is able to do that, but a great way for students to think about, I keep going back to this word energy, right?
Hmm.
You can do this and you can do this exercise and you can think about journaling in the 5221 way that you just described. And you can apply that all to your classes that you're already currently involved in.
Right.
For example, most biology students have to take, organic chemistry, which has a big, heavy laboratory component. And, if you wanted to, you could do more big, heavy lab courses. So, a good exercise to do is to think, what are you gravitating towards? Like, do you find yourself being pulled towards these classes where you know that you're going to have to be in the lab? Does that excite you? Does that energize you? Or are you more drawn to courses where you might have to do more like analytics work at a computer, for example, because that's also something that's definitely a possibility, like biostatistics, right? Or is it something else entirely that's energizing you? So when you're thinking about selecting your courses for the upcoming semester, think about what excites you the most. And that's a really good way to think about where your strengths might lie in relationship to what kind of a future career you might want.
So for those folks who, again, don't have the benefit of a work term, but if you were to kind of give an overview of what else there is out in industry, and then maybe we can do it like a deeper dive in
Yeah,
kind of the pharma and the area that
yeah,
you know. But what are some other things that folks can potentially look at? And when they kind of hear these things, go find someone who does the work, right?
yeah.
Have a coffee chat, have a Zoom conversation, and connect with them and see what resonates with you. And if you can't do that work yourself, at least see if you can vicariously get the information from someone else. And yeah, try to listen to see if as we're going through them, like which ones kind of resonate with you. So what are some of the things that folks should consider outside of just kind of the medicine and the research, med school and research side?
Yeah, sure. So I'll share this in the form of like three tactical things that you can actually do.
Mm,
The first one I'll say is attend networking nights.
okay.
U of T Scarborough hosts annually something called Science Networking Night, and that's where you can learn about different people in different industries. That's how I first learned about this interesting field called regulatory affairs. I had no idea about it before. So joining networking nights. Another organization to follow would be Life Sciences Ontario, LSO. They have a lot of resources on their page, and they've got companies that they work with, and it's just about Googling these things. If there's a company that comes up and you're like, "What is this?" Google it, see what they do, what do they make, how do they benefit the world.
Right.
The second thing is um, the Academic Advising and Career Center, the AANCC, at UTSC has a web page called What Can I Do with My Degree? Um, and they have a section for students with a biology degree, and there's a bunch of different sample jobs there. So take those and Google it. Um, and the third piece of advice I'd say is you can go on job boards like Indeed.com and you can type in, your degree name into the search bar and it will pull up for you job postings that are seeking students with that degree.
Mhm.
So that being said, um, just some really, really like random and broad examples is that you could work in the pharmaceutical industry, which means making medicines for people. You could work in medical devices, which means making things that help people feel better. Like when you get a heart surgery and you gotta like put a stent in your heart, like that's a medical device, for example. There's also policy, and public policy is a huge field which absolutely needs people in science to be able to make decisions and help with policy progression. There's also healthcare in general as a field. You don't have to work as a doctor, but um, you can work in like healthcare administration, and that relates more to this broad field of public health, which a lot of folks end up going into. Um, there's also things like biotechnology in agriculture, right? Our food is so influenced by biology, and we need a lot of smart folks in that sector as well. So in terms of like tactical advice in order to, how do I start learning about it? I'll go back and say networking events, search on job boards, like literally search your degree on job boards and you'll find things. And just Google something. If there's a company you've never heard of or a person you're interested in, Google them and search them on LinkedIn and click around. Just go exploring.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. And what came to mind for me is for folks to actually block off that time, right? So I have a concept called non-negotiable time, which I recommend folks to do, but basically block off an hour a week, an hour a day if you can, and say, you know what, this is when I'm going to do what Ellie suggested, what anybody suggested to me, right? Because when are you going to randomly click and search for this stuff? Most people would rather be on YouTube or on Instagram or TikTok or whatever and going through their feed there, not really researching this. So, and you're not going to have a group assignment on this. So block off some of this career time for yourself to explore. And yeah, search on those sites. And obviously, if you're not from UT Scarborough, your respective career center and the areas there. Though I'm sure you can search for resources at other schools as well, just for those references. And networking, I think, is definitely one where connecting with people and engaging in conversations to hear it from the horse's mouth, as they say. Like, what do you do? What do you like about what you do? What don't you like about what you do? And having those types of conversations, I think, can be quite eye-opening. And in lieu of being able to actually do the work itself, hearing it from somebody else and hearing to your point about like the energy, what sounds like energizing, and say, wow, that sounds really cool, versus oh, that doesn't sound interesting whatsoever. And I encourage folks to do that with a couple of people, because sometimes it's just that person who they're not very energetic in general, so they give you a false impression. But if you constantly have those non-energetic people, well, then maybe that's a sign. And if you constantly find those energetic people, well, maybe that's a sign in another direction, right? So yeah, explore broadly. And if you're to go back to some of like the earlier conversations that you had, so when you knew nothing about stuff and you wanted to kind of ask them about it to get more familiar, so maybe at one of those networking events, like what did you ask them, or like did you naturally know how to have a conversation, or were there specific questions that you found to be helpful, that folks can kind of borrow and maybe model off of it, or I don't know
Yeah,
if you remember, but like what suggestions would you have on the networking front?
great. I'll start off with two observations about people, and I think you can agree. The first thing is that people love to talk about themselves.
They do, yeah.
They love it.
Yeah.
So if you are a a young undergrad, if you're inexperienced and you think, oh my gosh, I don't know what to ask them about themselves. People love talking about themselves. They will talk your head off.
Mhm.
The second thing is in the context of a networking event. If someone is at a networking event, it means that they are there and they are willing to talk and they want to talk and they want to form connections. So it is perfectly okay to say to somebody who you're interested in speaking with, it's okay to say, I'm really interested in your job title. For example, if they're a consultant, it's okay to say, I'm really interested in your job title of consultant, but I don't know what consulting entails. Can you tell me more?
Mhm.
And chances are that person will be happy to explain it to you. Um, so I'd say just as a general, piece of advice, if you do see somebody with a job title that you don't know, I mean, chances are you can Google it, like pull out your phone and just quickly Google it and see if you can get any of sort of a general idea. But in terms of actually talking to people, it's okay to say that you don't know because
Mhm.
people love to explain and they love to feel like they're being helpful to you.
Yeah, I think that that's great advice. So put yourself out there. So even if you're kind of one of those more shy people who don't want to initiate the conversations, the people at networking events are there because they're volunteering their time because they want to share their knowledge and wisdom and experience with students or whomever are in attendance. So make sure you take that opportunity. And yeah, I would agree that people generally like to speak about themselves. Now, some people have different buttons. I say that people have their button topics, right? You push the right button and they keep going and going and going and going.
Yeah.
But certain other buttons are a little more stuck and not as interesting because maybe they've said it so many times before. I think what you mentioned before about like, well, can you tell me more? I think that's a great phrase that folks can use just to talk about consulting or whatever. And then when they explain things, oh, wow, that's so interesting. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? And oftentimes that curiosity is one where folks open up to because
Yeah.
folks have this well, I guess there's an impression of networking events as you have to go out, you have to sell yourself, you have to have a pitch and stuff like that, but a lot of the times can be spent listening and just asking questions and getting more information for others. So conversation is two sides. So I would recommend folks, especially earlier on, to spend more of the conversation listening and
Yeah.
getting that. And oftentimes, even just doing that gives people a good impression about you because, wow, they're so attentive and stuff like that. Now, you also want to share stuff about you and your accomplishments so that they can remember you in that versus, oh, that Ellie she just asks tons and tons of questions, right? But
Yeah.
that could be a good thing as well. So
Yeah.
I think that's some good advice.
Yeah.
Can you walk us?
So
Go ahead.
yeah, so I'll just add one more thing. So like the first question that you can ask is, can you tell me more about X, Y, and Z?
Sure,
And a nice question to ask when you're closing off is, what advice would you give to someone who's interested in entering this field?
sure.
Because again, people love to give advice and they love to feel like their advice is valued. So if you flat out say, I want advice, I think I say that all the time to people and it's never hit badly.
Yeah. And I'd recommend folks to walk away with some connection information. So
Hmm.
sometimes people give business cards, say, can I connect with you on LinkedIn or get an email or whatever, and see if you can. Some people will say no because they don't want some random student or whatever person to connect with them. But most of them are there because they would love to kind of offer their advice and guidance. So make sure you walk away with something. I know a lot of folks will go to an event and they will give their cards, right? And then hoping that that person will contact them but not take it for themselves. But it's like, well, now it's up to them to respond. And versus if you have their contact information, it's up to you to put it. And then it's really your initiative that will allow you to connect with that person versus hoping and praying that they'll get back to you. Um, so we found some information about different areas. We've talked to a bunch of people. We've got some insights and maybe something that energize us or don't. Walk us through kind of the area that you got energized in. So pharmaceuticals and what can some folks kind of match up to other areas and say, okay, this is what's in pharma, but how could they relate it to, I don't know, med devices, environmental, whatever? Because there's probably similar things to look out for there. So what are some of the intricacies of pharma that you found kind of fascinating that folks might be interested in?
Great. So the field I work in is called pharmaceuticals, and all that means is that it's anyone who makes medicines for people. And so I always thought that entering the pharmaceutical industry was interesting because you're making medicines for people. You help people feel better and live longer lives. And I just thought that that was such a cool calling. So in terms of how how I was able to find out more about that and how I got more involved was, like I said, I started off working at Sanofi Pasteur, which makes vaccines.
Mhm.
And while I was at Sanofi Pasteur, what I did was a lot of LinkedIn stalking. I would find people's names like on the door frame of their office, and I would search them on LinkedIn and say, what do they do? How did they get there? What was their career path? So, yeah, like a lot of creepy behavior. But that's how I learned so much about, different people's career paths. And in terms of, how that propelled me forward into working in pharmaceuticals, still today, I work at a company called GSK. While I was at Sanofi Pasteur, I learned about this master's degree program called the Master of Biotechnology. It's hosted out of U of T Mississauga campus. And I learned that a lot of people who do the M-Biotech program end up working in the pharmaceutical industry. There's a very close connection between M-Biotech and working in pharma. And so that was really my springboard, meeting folks who had graduated from that program, liking their energy and liking what I saw that they were doing, which is, working in the space, but not necessarily in the laboratory. And then that led to me applying for M-Biotech, getting in, and then getting another job at GSK, where I ended up staying and where I'm very happily situated right now.
Cool. So it sounds like it's another point for networking, connecting with folks, and kind of aligning. Like you happen to meet folks that you align with. You liked what they were speaking about, and yeah, it gave you more insights into an area that, and just kind of reconfirmed that you know what, I want to keep on going down that path. Right? So, I think that's great, and a lot of useful information for folks that are trying to think of other things to do with their biology degree other than medicine or research. Are there any other thoughts or advice or guidance that you'd want to give for folks if they're kind of considering? So definitely spend some time to research and network, so that non-negotiable time. Maybe add that reflection exercise too, connecting with lots of people, maybe some of that stalking that you mentioned, or maybe not so much on that side, but at least learning about their paths. What other things might folks want to do, or what advice would you have for them?
I'd say that an important thing to understand is that you can work in a different industry, but not have a degree that might not seem to directly connect. Um, One random example I thought about is that I know somebody who who completed their Master of Biotechnology degree, and they work in the cosmetics industry right now. They're a regulatory affairs professionals in cosmetics, and so you might not necessarily think of a science degree as being related to the cosmetics industry, but it is, especially from like a chemistry point of view, for example.
Sure.
So all this is to say is that for folks who are thinking about different career paths, again, think about something that might you interact with on a daily basis, right? That you're thinking, oh, like, do I have a place here? And you can search up on job boards. I'll give a random example. I really like CeraVe face wash. And what you could do is you could go to their company website, you can click on their jobs that they've got on their job board, and you can see what kind of people are they hiring? Are they hiring scientists who need a biology degree? Okay, I'm gonna go work for CeraVe or whatever their parent company, I guess it would be.
Yeah.
So that's like one thing. And again, I'd say on LinkedIn, use, search for people who people who might have graduated from the same university as you. See what they're up to. You can also search in LinkedIn for your degree, and it will pull up people who have done the same degree as you. See what company they work at, and use LinkedIn to click around and see what are these other companies that are in that industry. And you're probably going to learn a lot of things and like learn about a lot of companies that you just didn't know existed.
Yeah, I think it's being open to the fact that there's probably way more than you even think, way more than we even mentioned. One thing that came to mind is I used to work at one of the big four for management consulting, and that's very kind of business heavy. I was on the tech side, and then I found out that someone we were working for was a nurse, and it's like, oh, that's kind of odd. Well, it made sense because we were implementing a technology system. It was a supply chain technology system, but for a set of hospitals, right? So her nursing expertise, even though she focused it on supply chain, her background was definitely very valuable, right? So there are ones where sometimes the unexpected degrees can lend you or land you in different areas. So I think that's great and useful advice. So is there anything else that you'd want to share with folks as they're trying to figure out what to do with their biology degree?
I'd say talk to as many people as you can. Even if you are, really shy and you feel like you have nothing valuable to ask, um, I'd say that what you can do is, prepare lists of questions in advance, prepare a list of folks who you'd like to speak to, and, be honest and open about the fact that, you're a new grad, you want to learn about your career options, and you're asking somebody for, 15, 20 minutes of their time on a phone call or a Zoom call. And you will find that through that process, people are way more willing to help than you might have assumed. So that's one thing. Another thing is that if you know somebody who works in a field that's even remotely what you might be considering, ask that person who else you should speak to.
Right.
The power of the network is that when you make a connection with one person, that person knows other people who they can connect you with. And again, the fact that you are a new grad and that you're willing to learn and that you want people to advise you, people love to talk about themselves and they love to give advice. So don't underestimate that power.
I think that's great and amazing advice. And yeah, I probably add my own 2 cents to it. But when you're connecting with someone, try to, instead of just answering or asking the generic stuff, do a bit of homework, right? What degree, what they did, and just say, well, I know that you did blah, 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 whatever it is. Can you tell me a little bit more about the decision process to go from here to there, or a little bit more about that? So that tell me more part is great. It's one, it suggests that you did some research and you're not gonna get them to tell the generic stuff that it's available to everyone. You're probing a little bit deeper. I think that's great. And the whole networking thing, realizing that when you connect with one person, you're not connecting with one person. You're connecting with the 10, 100, 1,000 people that they're connected to do as well. And on the opposite side of that is make sure you're nice to everyone because you never know who that person knows. Because if you network on the non caring way where you're trying to use people and stuff like that, sometimes it comes back to bite you later on. So yeah, I think that's a lot of great and useful advice. And thanks, Ellie, so much for sharing your insights and wisdom on what to do with your biology degree. And hopefully we'll get you back for another topic.
Thank you, Luki.
Thanks for joining us on the SIWIKE Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier, the podcast. If you like the podcast, please subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you found this podcast. And if you can give us a review, that would be very appreciated. Feel free to contact me on LinkedIn at Lukidanu, Lukidanu, and the same on most social media platforms. And I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks. Bye.